The medical station called Valith's Grace floated in the darkness of space like a silver flower blooming among the stars. And on this night it was filled with panic and fear, and the sound of alien voices shouting orders that nobody could follow. Fast enough, Dar Valon was the chief doctor on the station, a tall creature with 4 arms and silver skin that shimmered like moonlight on water. And she had seen many strange things in her 200 years of medical practice. But nothing had prepared her for what lay dying in her xenobiology wing tonight. The Crethon had arrived 3 hours ago, pulled from the wreckage of a small ship that had crashed into an asteroid in the belt nearby. And when the rescue team had opened the twisted metal hull, they had found 2 of the beasts inside. One was already dead, its massive body cold and still, and the other was alive but barely breathing, its eyes staring at nothing as if it had already given up on the universe. These creatures were known across the galaxy as some of the most powerful beings ever to walk on any world, with bodies like a mix of wolf and bear covered in scales as black as the void between stars, and with 6 legs that could carry them faster than most vehicles could travel, and with teeth and claws that could tear through metal like paper. But the Crethon were also known for something else, something that made them both wonderful and tragic at the same time. They bonded with a single partner for their entire lives, sharing thoughts and feelings and dreams through a connection that no scientist had ever fully understood. And when that bond was broken by death, the surviving partner entered what the galaxy called the fading. The fading was not a disease that could be cured or a wound that could be healed. It was grief so deep and so complete that the body simply forgot how to live. And every Crethon who had ever lost their bonded partner had died within days, their hearts slowing and their minds dimming until there was nothing left. But an empty shell Dar Valon had read about this in her studies many years ago. But reading about something and seeing it happen were 2 very different things. And as she stood at the observation window, looking down at the creature her people had named Corvith, she felt a sadness that surprised her. The beast was enormous, taking up most of the containment chamber, and its scales that should have been shining like polished obsidian were now dull and gray, and its eyes that should have been burning with fierce intelligence were clouded and empty. And from deep within its chest came a sound that made everyone who heard it want to weep. It was a keening, a low vibration that seemed to pass through walls and floors and bones. And it was the sound of a heart that had been torn in half and did not know how to keep beating with only 1 piece left. "What have you tried so far?" Dr. Valon asked her team, and her voice was calm but her 4 hands were trembling slightly at her sides. "Everything," said Dr. Melox, a small green creature with large eyes and a voice like rustling leaves. And he pulled up a holographic display that showed all the treatments they had attempted in the last 3 hours. Neural stimulants to wake up the brain, hormonal injections to restart the body's natural processes, empathic resonators that were supposed to simulate the feeling of a bonded connection, and a dozen other experimental procedures that had worked on other species, but did nothing for the Crethon. "The fading is not a malfunction," Dr. Valon said quietly, and she pressed one of her hands against the cold glass of the observation window. "There is a choice that the body makes when the mind cannot bear to go on living." "Then what can we do?" asked another doctor, a young Telari with blue feathers and worried eyes. Valon did not answer right away because she did not have an answer to give. And instead she watched as Corvith's breathing grew slower and more shallow with each passing minute. And she watched as the monitors showed the creature's heart rate dropping bit by bit like sand falling through an hourglass. She had seen death many times in her long career, and she had learned to accept it as a natural part of existence. But there was something about this death that felt wrong. Something about watching a creature die not from injury or illness, but from loneliness and loss. The station had received a message from the Crethon homeworld asking about the survivor. and Dr. Vylon had been forced to tell them the truth. Their son was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The response had been a single word in the Crethon language that translated roughly as understood, and Dr. Vylon had wondered what it must be like to belong to a species that knew this kind of loss so well that they had a protocol for it for the next 15 hours. The medical team tried everything they could think of, and many things they had never tried before. And through it all, Corvus lay motionless on the floor of the containment chamber, its massive chest rising and falling in a rhythm that grew weaker with each passing hour. They brought in specialists from other parts of the station who had studied Crethon biology, and they consulted databases from 100 different worlds looking for any treatment that might help. And they even tried playing recordings of Crethon, morning calls in the hope that the sound might reach whatever was left of Corvus's mind. Nothing worked. And as the 18th hour came to an end, Dr. Vylon gathered her team outside the observation window and spoke the words that every doctor dreaded. "There is nothing more we can do," she said, and her silver skin had gone pale with exhaustion and sorrow. "The fading has taken hold too deeply, and the creature's will to live has been extinguished. It will be dead by morning, and all we can do now is make sure it does not suffer." The other doctors nodded slowly, their faces showing the same mixture of sadness and frustration that Dr. Vylon felt in her own hearts. And one by one they began to leave the observation deck to file their reports and prepare for the inevitable. But Dr. Vylon stayed at the window a little longer, watching the dying beast and listening to that terrible keening sound that had not stopped since Corvus arrived. And she wondered if somewhere in the universe there was a force that could reach a heart that had decided to stop beating. She did not know that the answer to her question was already on the station, wandering through corridors it was not supposed to be in, drawn by a sound that it should not have been able to hear. She did not know that everything was about to change. Marcus Chen was 11 years old, and he was not supposed to be on this part of the station. But Marcus had never been very good at staying where he was supposed to be, and his mother often said that curiosity would be the death of him someday. His mother was a cargo hauler named Sarah Chen, a woman with tired eyes and strong hands who had been flying freight ships across the galaxy since before Marcus was born. And they had stopped at Valus Grace because their ship had developed a problem with its engine that needed fixing. Before they could continue their journey, stay in the waiting area, his mother had told him as she went off to argue with the mechanics about prices and parts. Read a book or play a game on your tablet, and do not wander off like you always do. Marcus had promised that he would stay put, and he had meant it at the time. But that was before he heard the sound. It started as a faint vibration in his chest, like the feeling you get when someone plays a very deep note on a very large instrument. And first Marcus thought it was just the station's engines humming through the walls. But then he realized that the sound was not mechanical at all. It was alive, and it was sad. And it was calling to something deep inside him that he did not have words for. He stood up from his seat in the waiting area and looked around. But none of the aliens nearby seemed to notice anything unusual. A group of Solari were talking quietly in the corner, and a Talari merchant was examining a display of trade goods, and none of them showed any sign that they could hear what Marcus was hearing. Maybe it was just in his head, he thought. Maybe he was imagining things because he was bored and tired, and wished he was somewhere more interesting than a medical station waiting room. But the sound did not stop, and it seemed to be getting louder, or maybe he was just becoming more aware of it. And before he knew what he was doing, Marcus was walking toward the door that led deeper into the station. He told himself he would just look around for a minute, and then come back before his mother noticed he was gone. But the sound kept pulling him forward like a hand wrapped around his heart. And he followed it through corridors and past doors and around corners until he had no idea Where he was anymore, the station was big and confusing, with hallways that curved in ways that did not make sense to human eyes, and signs written in languages that Marcus could not read. But he did not feel lost, because the sound was like a compass that always pointed him in the right direction. He passed through a service corridor that smelled like oil and electricity, and he squeezed through a gap between two large machines that were humming with power. And finally, he came to a door that slid open when he approached and led him into a large room, filled with windows and monitors and alien doctors who were too busy looking at their screens to notice a small human boy slipping past them. The observation deck overlooked a large chamber with white walls and a floor covered in some kind of soft material. And in the middle of that chamber lay the biggest creature Marcus had ever seen. It was like something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare, with a body covered in dark scales and 6 legs ending in claws that looked sharp enough to cut through stone, and a head with a long snout and ears that lay flat against its skull, and eyes that were open but seemed to be looking at nothing at all. The sound was coming from this creature, Marcus realized, and now that he was close, he could hear it clearly. It was not just a vibration anymore, but something like a song, or maybe a cry, or maybe both at the same time. And it was the saddest thing Marcus had ever heard in his entire life. He stood at the observation window and watched the creature breathe, its massive chest rising and falling in a slow and unsteady rhythm. And he felt tears starting to form in his eyes, even though he did not know why. The alien doctors were talking to each other in low voices, and Marcus could hear them through his translator implant, the little device that his mother had gotten him when he was 5, so he could understand all the different languages spoken in the galaxy. The heart rate is dropping faster. Now, one of them said, "It will not last much longer," said another. "Such a shame. To die from grief alone," said a third. Marcus did not understand everything they were talking about, but he understood enough. The creature was dying, and nobody could save it. And it was dying because it was sad he knew what that felt like 2 years ago. When Marcus was 9, his father had died in an accident on a mining rig far from any world. And for a long time afterward, Marcus had felt like a part of him had died too. He had stopped eating and stopped playing and stopped caring about anything. And some nights he had lain awake wondering if there was any point in going on without his dad. His mother had saved him, holding him through the long nights and talking to him through the dark days and never giving up even when Marcus had wanted to give up on everything. And slowly he had learned how to live again, even though the sadness never completely went away. Maybe, he thought, maybe this creature did not have anyone to hold it through the dark. He looked at the door to the containment chamber, a heavy metal barrier with a control panel beside it. And he knew he should not go in there because it was dangerous and against the rules, and his mother would be so angry if she found out. But the creature was alone in there, dying from loneliness, and Marcus could not bear to just stand and watch. He walked over to the control panel and looked at the buttons and switches. And he remembered all the times his father had taught him about machines and how they worked. And he remembered the tricks his dad had shown him for bypassing security locks when they got stuck in places they should not be. Sometimes rules are meant to be broken, his father used to say with a wink. Especially when someone needs help. Marcus's hands moved across the control panel, pressing buttons in a sequence that he half remembered and half guessed. And to his surprise, the door hissed open, and a wave of warm air washed over him, carrying the smell of something wild, and ancient alarms started blaring immediately, loud and harsh, and Marcus heard the doctors behind him shouting in surprise and fear. But he did not stop. He walked through the door and into the containment chamber, and the creature's clouded eyes turned toward him. And for the first time since it had arrived on the station, there was something in those eyes besides emptiness. It was curiosity and fear, and maybe just a little bit of hope. and Marcus was not afraid at all. Dear Valen had been walking toward her office to write the final report on the Crethon, patient when the alarm started screaming through the station, and she spun around and ran back to the observation deck faster than she had moved in 50 years. When she arrived, she found her entire medical team pressed against the observation window, their faces showing expressions of horror and disbelief. And when she pushed through them to see what they were looking at, her 4 hearts nearly stopped beating all at once. There was a child in the containment chamber, a human child, small and fragile and completely defenseless, standing just a few steps away from a creature that could tear him apart with a single swipe of its claws. And the child was not running or screaming or trying to escape. He was walking toward the beast. "Get security in here now," Dear Valen shouted, and she reached for the emergency control panel that would open the chamber door. But then something made her stop. She was a Silori, and her species had the ability to sense emotions in the air around them, to feel what others were feeling like a breeze against their skin. And what she felt coming from that human child made her freeze with her hand hovering over the controls. There was no fear in him, not even a little bit. Not even the smallest trace of the terror that any sensible creature should feel when facing a Crethon. And in place of that fear, there was something else. Something warm and steady and strong. It was compassion, pure and simple. And it was flowing out of that small human body like light from a star. "Wait," Dr. Valen said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Everyone wait." The security team arrived with weapons drawn and ready. But Dr. Valen raised one of her hands to stop them from entering the chamber. "What are you doing?" The security chief demanded. "That child will be killed." "No," Dr. Valen said slowly, and she was not sure why she was so certain, but she was. "No, I do not think he will inside the chamber." Marcus had stopped walking about 3 steps away from Corvith's massive head, and he stood there looking at the creature while the creature looked back at him with those clouded gray eyes. The Crethon let out a low growl that rumbled through the floor and up through Marcus's legs and into his chest. And it was a warning, a threat, a sound that said, "Go away and leave me alone." But Marcus did not go away. And instead he did something that made every alien watching gasp in shock. He sat down right there on the floor, cross-legged like he was sitting in his own bedroom at home. And he put his hands on his knees, and he looked up at the beast, and he spoke in a voice that was quiet but steady. "I know," he said. The growl faded into something softer, something confused, and Corvith's ears twitched slightly as if it was trying to understand what this strange small creature was doing. "I know what you're feeling," Marcus continued, and his voice cracked a little, but he kept talking anyway. "I know it hurts so much that you can't breathe, and I know you feel like there's no point in going on, and I know you just want it to stop." Dr. Valen leaned closer to the window, her translator implant catching every word the boy was saying, and she felt something strange happening in the emotional currents of the room. "My dad died 2 years ago," Marcus said, and now his eyes were wet, but he did not look away from Corvith's gaze. "There was an accident on the mining rig where he worked, and one day he was there, and the next day he was gone, and I didn't even get to say goodbye." The Crethon made a sound that was not a growl and not a whimper, but something in between, and its eyes seemed to focus on Marcus's face with an intensity that had not been there before. "Everyone kept telling me it would get better," Marcus went on. "They said time heals everything, and one day I would wake up and the hurt would be gone. But that's not true, is it?" He reached out his hand slowly, so slowly, and laid it on Corvith's snout just above the nostrils, where the scales were smooth and warm. "The hurt doesn't go away," Marcus whispered. "It just changes. It becomes part of you, and you learn to carry it with you wherever you go. And some days, it's heavier than other days. But it's always there, outside the chamber." There Valon realized that her own eyes were wet, and she looked around and saw that several of her colleagues were in the same state. Their various forms of tears falling down their various forms of faces. But here's the thing, Marcus said, and his small hand pressed gently against Corvith's scales. You don't have to carry it alone. You don't have to be by yourself in the dark. And just because the one you loved is gone doesn't mean there's no one left who cares. The keening sound that had been coming from Corvith's chest since it arrived on the station began to change, shifting from a cry of pure despair to something else. Something that had a question in it. I'm here, Marcus said. And those two words seemed to fill the entire chamber with warmth. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. And you're not alone. The Crithin let out a long, shuddering breath, and its eyes that had been clouded and gray began to show the faintest hint of gold around the edges. And it did not pull away from the touch of the human boy there. Valon watched in amazement as the vital signs on her monitors, which had been dropping steadily toward death for hours, suddenly stopped falling, and then, impossibly, they began to rise. What is happening? Dr. Melox asked in a voice filled with wonder. Dr. Vila shook her head slowly, her silver skin reflecting the light of the monitors as their numbers climbed higher and higher. I have no idea, she admitted. But whatever it is, we should not interrupt it. So they stood and watched as a human child sat with a dying beast, his hand on its face and his heart open wide. And they witnessed something that none of them had ever seen before. They witnessed the impossible beginning of hope. The hours passed slowly on Valith's grace, and in the containment chamber, nothing moved except the gentle rise and fall of two chests breathing in rhythm with each other. Marcus had not left Corvith's side, and the medical team had not tried to make him leave, because every time someone suggested removing the boy from the chamber, Dr. Valon would point at the monitors and shake her head. The numbers did not lie. And the numbers were showing something that every textbook and every research paper and every expert in the galaxy had said was impossible. The fading was slowing down, not stopping completely. Not yet, but slowing in a way that had never been documented before. And Dr. Valon had called in specialists from 3 different departments to confirm that her equipment was working correctly, because she could not believe what she was seeing with her own eyes. The neural activity has increased by 40% in the last 2 hours, Dr. Melox reported, his green face glowing with excitement. And the hormonal cascade that causes the fading to accelerate has almost completely stopped. The creature's heart rate is stabilizing, added another doctor, a Telari named Kess, whose blue feathers were ruffled with amazement. It was at 32 beats per minute when the boy entered the chamber, and now it is at 51 and climbing. Dr. Valon stood at the observation window and watched the scene inside the chamber, trying to understand what she was witnessing. The human boy had been talking for hours, his voice quiet but steady, telling the Crethin stories about his life and his father and his mother and all the small moments that make up a childhood. He talked about birthday parties and school trips and the time he had gotten lost in a spaceport and been found by a kind Salori woman who had given him candy while they waited for his mother to arrive. Sometimes he would stop talking and just sit in silence, his hand resting on Corvith's snout. And during those quiet moments, the beast would make soft sounds that were not quite words, but seemed to carry meaning anyway. And sometimes Marcus would fall asleep leaning against Corvith's massive shoulder, and the creature would curl its body around him slightly as if to keep him warm. And Dr. Valon would feel her heart's ache with an emotion she could not name. I need to understand how this is happening, she said to her team. And she pulled up everything the station's database had on humans, scrolling through pages of information that she had never bothered to read before because humans were such a young species and there had never seemed to be anything special about them. But now she read with new eyes. And she began to notice things that she had missed before. Humans were social creatures who had evolved on a harsh world, where survival depended on cooperation and connection. And their brains had developed remarkable abilities for forming bonds with others. They released chemicals like oxytocin and serotonin when they touched other beings. Chemicals that created feelings of trust and comfort and safety. More interesting still, humans could form these bonds with almost any creature they encountered. They kept animals as companions, treating other species as members of their own families. And they had been known to form emotional attachments to machines and objects and even imaginary beings. They are generalists, Dr. Valen murmured as she read. Where most species bond only with their own kind. Humans can connect with anything, but there was more to it than just biology. She realized as she watched Marcus wake up from his nap and immediately begin talking to Corvus again, asking the creature questions that it could not answer, but listening as if it could. Humans had developed something that went beyond chemical reactions and neural pathways. They had developed empathy so deep and so powerful that they could feel the pain of others as if it were their own. And they had developed compassion so strong that they would walk into danger without hesitation if they thought they could help someone who was suffering. Look at this, Dr. Mellock said, pointing at a passage in the database. Humans have been documented forming bonds with creatures on their homeworld that could kill them with ease. Large predators, venomous reptiles, animals that no sensible species would approach. And yet humans approach them anyway, not just approach them, Dr. Kess added, reading over his colleague's shoulder. They take care of them, they heal them, they love them. There are records of humans risking their lives to save creatures that most species would consider nothing more than dangerous beasts. Dr. Valen thought about the boy in the chamber, about how he had walked past every safety measure and every warning and every instinct that should have told him to run away. And she began to understand something important. The Crethon bond was a powerful thing, a connection that linked two beings together at the deepest level. And when that bond was broken, the survivor lost the will to live because they had lost the one thing that made life meaningful. But the human boy was not trying to replace that bond. He was not trying to become a new partner for the grieving creature. He was simply refusing to let Corvus be alone in its pain. He was sitting with the beast in its darkest hour, holding space for its grief, witnessing its suffering without trying to fix it or change it or make it go away. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. By the 6th hour, Corvus' scales had begun to regain their shine. Faint glimmers of reflected light appearing on surfaces that had been dull and gray by the 9th hour. The creature lifted its head for the first time since arriving on the station, and looked at Marcus with eyes that were no longer clouded but burning with a soft golden light. By the 12th hour, Corvus made a sound that the translation software could not parse. Something between a purr and a sigh and a word that had no equivalent in any language the station knew. And Marcus smiled and scratched behind the creature's ears as if it were a pet dog and not a being that could tear through starship hulls. And then the door to the observation deck opened, and a human woman burst through with panic on her face and fear in her eyes. Marcus! Sarah Chun shouted when she saw her son through the observation window. Marcus, what have you done? She ran toward the containment chamber door, ready to charge in and rescue her child. But Dr. Valen stepped in front of her with all 4 arms raised. Wait, the doctor said gently. Please, look. Sarah Chun looked through the window, and she saw her son curled up against a creature 10 times his size, both of them breathing slowly and peacefully. And she saw the monitors showing vital signs that were stronger than they had been in days. What is happening? She whispered. Your son, Dr. Valen said with something like awe in her voice. Your son is doing something that we could not do with all our medicine and all our technology. She paused and looked at the sleeping pair in the chamber. He is reminding a dying creature that it is not alone in the universe. 1 year had passed since the night that changed everything on Valith's Grace, and the galaxy had not stopped talking about what happened in that containment. CHAMBERDR Valon's report had gone through 17 revisions before she was satisfied with it. And even then she knew that the words on the page could never capture what she had witnessed with her own eyes. How do you describe the moment when science meets something it cannot explain? When all your knowledge and training becomes useless, and you are forced to simply watch and wonder. She had titled the report, Human Empathic Intervention in Terminal Crethan Fading, a case study, and she had submitted it to the Galactic Medical Council with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Knowing that her colleagues would probably think she had lost her mind, the first 3 times she submitted it, they rejected it without even reading past the summary. This is impossible, the review board had written. The fading cannot be reversed through emotional contact alone, and your claims about human empathic capabilities are not supported by established research. But Dr. Valon had evidence that could not be ignored. She had recordings and biological samples and monitor data and the testimony of her entire medical team. And most importantly, she had Corvith. Crethan had not died against. Every expectation and every prediction and every piece of knowledge that the galaxy had accumulated about the species. Corvith had survived the fading and was still alive and growing stronger every day. The creature now lived in a special habitat on Valith's Grace, a large enclosure that had been built specifically for it. After it became clear that it was not going to die and would need somewhere to stay. The habitat had trees and water and space to run, and it had become something of a tourist attraction for visitors to the station who wanted to see the miracle beast with their own eyes. But what really drew the crowds was not the Crethan itself, but the boy who came to visit. Marcus Chen had received a lifetime pass to the station, a small card that allowed him free passage whenever his mother's cargo ship passed through the sector, and he used it as often as he could. Sometimes he would stay for just a few hours, and sometimes he would stay for days, sitting with Corvith in the habitat and talking about everything and nothing. The beast always knew when he was coming. The station staff had learned to watch Corvith's behavior for signs of Marcus's arrival, because the creature would become restless and excited hours before the boy ship even entered the system, pacing back and forth and making sounds that everyone had come to recognize as happiness. And when Marcus finally walked through the airlock and made his way to the habitat, Corvith would greet him with a rumbling noise that shook the walls and a gesture that looked remarkably like a hug, wrapping its massive head around the boy's small body and holding him close. They're bonded, Dr. Valon had written in her report. Not in the same way that Crethan bond with each other, but in a way that is no less real and no less powerful. The human did not replace the creature's lost partner, but he gave it something to live for when it had forgotten how to want to live. The report was eventually accepted on the 4th submission, after a delegation of scientists visited the station and saw the evidence for themselves. And once it was published, it spread across the galaxy like fire spreading across dry grass. Everyone wanted to know about the human boy who had done what no medicine could do, who had walked into a room with a dying beast and refused to let it be alone. And the story grew in the telling until Marcus Chen became famous on worlds he had never visited and among species he had never met. A journalist from the Central News Network came to interview him on his 12th birthday. A Talari woman with bright blue feathers and a camera drone hovering over her shoulder. And she asked him the question that everyone wanted answered. How did you do it? She asked, how did a human child succeed where the finest doctors in the quadrant failed? Marcus was sitting in the habitat with Corvith beside him, the creature's massive head resting on his lap while he scratched behind its ears. And he looked at the journalist with confusion on his face. I didn't do anything special, he said, and his voice was honest and puzzled. I just sat with him. I just talked to him. I just let him know he wasn't alone. Anyone could have done that. The journalist smiled and shook her head, and she looked at her camera drone to make sure it was recording. No, she said gently. I don't think anyone could have done that. Other species would have been too afraid, or too logical, or too focused on finding a medical solution to think of simply sitting with a grieving creature. She leaned forward and asked another question. Were you not afraid when you walked into that chamber? The Crethon could have killed you with a single movement. Marcus thought about the question for a moment, and then he shrugged. I guess I knew he wouldn't hurt me, he said. I knew he was sad, not angry, and I knew what it felt like to be that sad. And I just wanted him to know that someone understood. The interview aired across hundreds of worlds and was translated into thousands of languages. And it changed the way the galaxy thought about humans for a long time. The older species had looked at humanity as a curiosity, a young race that was smart enough to travel the stars, but not wise enough to be taken seriously. Humans were fragile and short-lived and emotional, and they had nothing to offer that couldn't be found in more advanced species. But now the galaxy was beginning to understand that those emotions, that fragility, that capacity for connection and compassion, was not a weakness at all. It was a gift. Dr. Valon watched the interview from her office on Valith's Grace, and she smiled when Marcus said that anyone could have done what he did. The boy was wrong, of course. What he had done was extraordinary, and most species would never even think to try it. But perhaps that was the most human thing about him. He did not see himself as special. He did not think he had done anything remarkable. He had simply seen someone suffering and had refused to look away, and in the end, that was what made all the difference. The story of Marcus Chun and the Crethon, who should have died, spread further and faster than anyone expected. And it planted a seed in the minds of species across the galaxy. Maybe, they began to think, maybe there was more to these humans than anyone had realized. Maybe compassion was a kind of strength that could not be measured in the usual ways, and maybe, in a universe full of wonders and terrors and mysteries beyond counting, the most powerful thing of all was simply being willing to say, I'm here, to someone who needed to hear it. As for Marcus, he never quite understood why everyone made such a fuss about what he had done that night. He had just done what felt right, what his father would have done, what any decent person should do when they find someone alone in the dark. But the galaxy would remember, and the galaxy would learn, and the next time someone dismissed humans as weak and emotional and unimportant, there would be voices raised to disagree, and somewhere on a medical station orbiting a distant world, a boy and a beast sat together in comfortable silence. Proof that the smallest acts of kindness could change everything.